right, welcome back to Read 508, week 3. This is screencast number 3. So we just finished talking about some of the aspects involved in the process of reading, and now we're going to talk about some of the major theories associated with the reading process. So I just want to make sure I did those individually. So the theories that they decided to talk about in this chapter were sub-skill theories, interactive theories, transactive theories, and taking a more balanced approach. So like with everything else that we discussed today, you're going to learn all of these in much greater depth in many of your other classes. In particular, this piece you will pick up in 514, and or you maybe, I guess, you're taking 514 now, and you'll definitely pick it up in the curriculum class, Read 536. So let's talk for a minute about subskill. So subskill theories are exactly what they sound like. It's a community of educators and researchers who believe that reading is a set of subskills that students must master and then learn to integrate. This is a behaviorist approach, kind of at its root, and some of these subskills they talk about or consider are things like phonemic awareness, graphophonic awareness and recognition, decoding, fluency, and then all kind of the pieces within those. And so an example of that might help you make sense of subskill would be like the idea of sight words, right? So the idea that you could practice these words and that students would memorize these words in isolation so that later on they would be able to recognize them automatically when they're in context would be something that would fit in nicely to a subskills approach to learning to read. So the idea is essentially that when all these subskills are learned to what they call automaticity, which means the brain does them automatically, that's when reading occurs. And so there's a lot of evidence to actually support that subskill theory can explain a lot of, or many aspects of the reading process. And that comes from the research that's been done and the evidence that shows that practicing some of these subskills on their own can help struggling readers improve their reading. So we are going to spend tons of time talking about subskill theory and tons of time talking about all of these. This is really just kind of the broad strokes, and the ones that the text selected are ones that really resonate kind of throughout this text and throughout this program. So then there's the interactive theories, and so interactive theories are really kind of information processing models, and so interactionist theorists would say that the reading process involves two types of processing, and that would be top-down versus bottom-up. So top-down processing would start with the reader, and bottom-up processing would start with the text. And so the idea behind top-down is that a reader approaches the reading act, they look at the text, they look at the topic, and they start to create predictions or hypotheses or set expectations or purpose for their reading or for the reading act, and that essentially the reading occurs as they attempt to meet these expectations or confirm their predictions. So it's kind of interesting because when you think about this idea of information processing, when you think about yourself when you read, when you think you know what's going to happen, so you think you've made a correct prediction or you think you have the appropriate or the correct hypothesis, then you skim the information and you or the text and you look for keywords because you're really just trying to confirm your prediction. Now, when you start to read and you realize you're not finding those keywords or the text isn't happening the way that you thought, that's kind of when you stop and you go back and you read more closely because your hypotheses or your predictions aren't being confirmed, and so then you stop skimming. Well, an effective reader does this anyway, stops skimming the text and goes back. And so I find myself doing this all the time. and I'm sure you do too. I was doing this just yesterday. I'm reading the novel Gone Girl, right? And so it's not really a spoiler, but if you haven't read it and you want to read it, I was starting to become convinced that the husband was the killer. And so I started reading real fast because I was just kind of looking for the things as they were having these conversations between him and his sister. And then all of a sudden something happened in the text that made me think twice. And so I kind of backpedaled a little bit, turned back a few pages, and started reading more closely because what I thought was going to unfold was not actually unfolding in the text. So that's an example of this top-down. So it's really driven by me as the reader and trying to kind of fulfill and confirm my own expectations and predictions for this particular reading act. So then bottom up would be kind of the opposite of this. So starting with the thinking or the reading process starts itself with the printed words or the symbols on the page. So that reading process starts when the reader reads, takes a look at these, starts to recognize them, and then from that recognition, they associate or make the associations that bring meaning to the words and the symbols. And so that's kind of when the information processing or the reading itself actually begins. These theories kind of worked in contrast to each other until Rumelhart published his first model, and you will learn, again, much more about Rumelhart in the next couple of semesters. But he introduced the idea of this interactive model in which the top-down processing and the bottom-up processing would occur simultaneously. So there's this loop, and that the processing goes both ways. So skilled readers do both of these things at the same time. And when you think about it, that's probably what you do when you think about yourself involved in the actual reading act. The transactive theories or models of reading. So Louise Rosenblatt is probably the most prominent transactive theorist that is out there and that you will spend time in this program learning about. And the idea behind the transactive reading models is that every reading act is a transaction between the reader and the text and the context in which it is happening. So the meaning occurs during that transaction. So Rosenblatt would say that a reader can choose, and a reader does choose this, so that's the part of the context piece. The reader chooses to either take an efferent stance towards text or an aesthetic stance towards text. And so an efferent stance would focus on getting information from the text. And so the actual act of reading becomes different. The way that one reads, how close one reads, is influenced on the fact or the idea that you're trying to pull information from this text. As opposed to the aesthetic response or the aesthetic stance, where the reader is more focused on the experience of the reading, the feelings or the memories or the images that are evoked by that particular reading act. So this is a really prominent theory and one in which lots of strategies come from. So this is one that we will definitely, be revisiting, definitely this semester, and then again in 514 and in 536. You'll hear these again. So then undoubtedly you have heard of taking a balanced approach, right? So this is kind of the holy grail, right? What we're all trying to do is take the best of all the theories that are out there and kind of take the approach that all of these theories don't have to be or aren't necessarily in conflict with one another, and you don't necessarily have to be in one camp or the other. And a lot of this comes out of particularly in the reading world, the reading wars of the 1980s, which again you'll learn more about. But there was this real battle between this idea of a direct skills or sub-skills approach to reading and a more holistic approach to reading. So you can boil it down to kind of phonics versus whole language, but it's much more than that, of course. So balancing, of course, not just how you instruct, but balancing between teaching skills behind word recognition and decoding and comprehension skills that don't necessarily have to happen in sequential order, but that they can happen simultaneously. balancing in kind of how you organize student learning, again, so that things can happen in concurrence with one another. They don't necessarily have to wait for one to occur for another to happen, and that students can actually become better readers when they're receiving instruction in many of those things. So a good way to think about a balanced approach is that we're here to learn all of these different theories, and what they're going to do is provide us with a toolkit, essentially, that we can draw from when we need to. So we know that not all readers are the same. We know that not all teaching techniques get us the same results with all readers. And so when you look at the different theories and you consider what they all have to offer, really thinking about that taking a balanced approach means knowing when and what to pull from all of these different models and theories that you learn about, and how do you put those together to create what we would consider a balanced program. So those are just some really, really broad strokes about about some of the theories that you're going to learn in this class and in some of the others. But they ended the chapter with this 15 principles of teaching reading. And so I'm just going to read them for you because these are really going to be the principles behind most of what you learn in this course this semester. So this idea that reading is a complex act with many factors that must be considered. So that was kind of the gist of today's discussion. Reading involves the construction of the meaning behind the printed symbols. So like we said, there is no reading if there is no comprehension. The idea of this balanced approach. So there is no one way or no one correct way to teach reading. Learning to read is a continuous process. I know I have become a better reader, even though I was probably reading, at a high school level by the time I was in 6th grade. I have certainly become a better reader than I was in the 6th grade. Students should be taught word recognition strategies that will allow them to become better independent readers, right? So any strategy, not just word recognition, but any strategy that you teach students is really a strategy that we want them to be able to learn to use strategically, which means use independently. Teachers should assess each student's reading ability and use that assessment to drive their instructional decisions. And this is also a theme that runs through all of our courses, and you'll spend tons of time. So these 15 principles really kind of underscore a lot of what we believe in as a program here at Fullerton. Reading and the other language arts are highly interrelated, and we will spend time talking about that in this class and others. Using complete literature selections in the reading program is important. Reading is an integral part of all content area instructions within the educational program. Every summer I teach the secondary credential students the content area literacy class, and it's always my battle in the beginning is convincing those math teachers that they are also reading teachers, because who better to teach somebody how to read math than somebody who is an expert in math, right? The student needs to see that reading can be an enjoyable pursuit, and I know that's something that teachers talk about all of the time, and probably something that many of you believe in. Sound teaching of all reading skills and strategies is important for all students. So the idea of equity and providing an equitable reading instruction for all students, which we know doesn't mean the same, right? Equal does not mean the same. Reading should be taught in a way that allows each student to experience success. Encouraging self-direction and self-monitoring of reading is important. This is also so important for those of you who have to teach with those scripted programs, is figuring out how do we do that gradual release? How do we get students to be able to do these things on their own? A supportive classroom organization can facilitate the teaching of reading, so bringing in some of those affective considerations, and that teachers must help students develop their facility in using technology to enhance their learning. And so I think this is something that many of us as teachers could improve on. And what's nice is that this is really, I feel, in the past 2 or 3 years, really coming into the discussion in more meaningful ways. And I think with the introduction and the evolution of Common Core that we'll be having this discussion even further. All right, so that is it for our discussion of Chapter 1. So make sure that you check the checklist and see what else, all of the assignments that are due for this week. Have a great week.